Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 mod roundup. Hope you're all doing well. A ton of new mods were just added as compatible for consoles and Macs. They've gone through the approval process and have been added to the official launcher, so if you're on a console or a Mac, then you are now able to use a bunch more mods. I think it's awesome that we continue to get mod support for this game, and that Larian have really integrated it into the game so that you can use it on console as well. So many games don't have console mod support, but this one does, so I really want to highlight some of my favorite mods that are now available for console. We're going to talk about 10 mods that I think are awesome and very much worth trying. These are mods that I've personally tested and used, and so I think that they not only work, but also add something really fun and interesting to the game, whether that be a new class, new mechanic, or a different way of approaching the game. And so I'm just going to talk about 10 of them, and we'll get to it. Alright, let's talk mods. The first mod that I want to highlight is the Blood Mage. The Blood Mage is an entirely new class, with 3 possible different subclasses, so it's a fully featured class just like the core 12 classes. Blood magic is kind of an archetype that is a staple of fantasy games that's missing from Baldur's Gate 3 and Dungeons & Dragons in general, honestly. It's especially relevant with the recent release of Dragon Age Veilguard, where blood magic is a pretty big part of the setting, so if you wanted to play a Dragon Age character in Baldur's Gate 3, maybe this class is the one for you. I think this is pretty cool, because the Blood Mage lets you sacrifice HP to cast spells, or regain spell slots, but then your spells steal life from enemies, so you play this sort of push-pull mechanic, where you are sacrificing your own health, stealing health from enemies, and as long as you're doing damage, you're healing back up. So you end up both as kind of a spellcaster that gets to cast a bunch of spells, but also as a lifesteal tank, something that also doesn't really exist in Dungeons & Dragons by default. So this class fills a lot of roles that otherwise can't be filled in Baldur's Gate 3. What I think makes this a really interesting mod to me is that it's a homebrewed class that is, in my opinion, a little bit underpowered compared to the 12 basic classes. Not horribly, it's still totally playable on Honor Mode, but unlike a lot of mods where the mod author cannot resist making their creation absolutely broken, the Blood Mage, I think, falls into an interesting balance point where the character actually is a little bit weaker than some of the base classes. You know, Swords, Bard, and whatever obviously are incredibly broken. And so you actually have to think and play tactically. That is something that's a little bit rare in homebrew content, so I wanted to highlight this one because as a homebrew, it falls at a good point on the balance. The Blood Magic uses Constitution as your casting stat, which is a pretty powerful thing because it means you're really good at concentration checks, and of course you have higher HP that you can then sacrifice in order to cast and recover your spells. But that's also just interesting mechanically. Nothing in Dungeons & Dragons uses Constitution in order to be aggressive. So this lets you be truly single attribute dependent. You really only need just Constitution and Dexterity for this character, and that is kind of cool mechanically because it means that you can spend your feats on other things as well, letting the character do a little bit more in the way of different mechanics. If you want to play a hybrid melee spellcaster or whatever, this character is capable of doing that because you will have 20 Constitution by the end game. Some of the highlights of this class include being able to steal life from enemies, a lot of bleeding synergy, which is kind of a sub-theme in Baldur's Gate that isn't really supported by the main game, but that the Blood Mage gets to use, and so if you have a lot of the bleeding items and bleeding synergy with a Tiger Barbarian, for example, this character can have a lot of really cool stuff going on. The 3 subclasses let you specialize into a more spellcasting focused character that can recover spell slots by taking damage, the Blood Magus, a more melee focused character that can become a melee character that trades its life for enemy life and for healing itself, or a more aggressively focused character that's just a pure damage dealer. You lose health very, very quickly with the Blood Reaver, but you kill enemies correspondingly quickly. I think all of these are really interesting subclasses, and so I think that this character class, because it's a homebrew that's just a little bit on the weaker side for balance, is really interesting to me. I really like to see mod authors make their characters reasonably balanced within the game, and so I recommend checking this one out. The second new class that I want to highlight is the Witch. The Witch is a really cool spellcasting class. It's sort of a cross between a wizard and a sorcerer, cast off of intelligence, but has so-called witchcraft points that let you do kind of the equivalent of sorceress metamagic. The Witch, I think, is a really neat idea. It's another homebrew class, but it is another class that focuses on kind of a gap in Dungeons & Dragons in general, because it is a class that's focused on debuffing, on poison use, on shapeshifting, so it really plays as a very tricky and tactical class. The mod author has said that they've balanced it around tactician, and I think that they've actually done a pretty good job of that. I think that this is another one that is slightly weaker than the default character classes, which I think is exactly the point of balance that you want your homebrew mechanics to fall on, because people who are, enfranchised enough to download and use a new class mod are going to be pretty good at the game. So you want your characters to provide interesting gameplay to people like you and me who have played a lot of Baldur's Gate 3. The Witch has 4 different subclasses. There is a more shapeshifting focused class, a poison focused class, a cold focused class, and a purely support casting focused class. I will say that the different subclasses to me are a little bit incoherent. I don't know if they should all go in the same character design, but I think that the Witch does enough interesting mechanical things that it's very much worth a look in your own playthroughs. And the fact that it has a poison-focused subclass is really cool to me, because Baldur's Gate has a lot of neat poison mechanics that it doesn't really do anything with. Much like the bleeding mechanics with the Blood Mage, we've got a couple poison-themed item sets and a whole bunch of poisons, which most players fully ignore throughout their playthroughs. So having a character that has these poison-based spells and effects that trigger off of poison, I think is in and of itself very cool. So the Witch has a lot of experimental and interesting ideas. I think it is less balanced and coherent than some of the other full classes, but I think it's very much worth trying, especially if you've done a lot of Baldur's Gate already and just want to sort of see what can happen when you try weird and interesting ideas in the game. This character class is very much for you. Third, and the mod that I would most highly recommend checking out of any of these mods, Mystra's spells. This mod adds 130 new spells to the game, which is an incredible amount of variety and tactical possibility and different options. And the great thing about this mod is that most of these spells, there's a couple homebrew spells that are in there just for fun, but most of these spells are just ports of spells that are available in tabletop 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. If you have wondered why a spell was missing, or felt like a character didn't have enough options, or felt like something just should be in the game that wasn't, this mod almost certainly adds it, because across all of the 10 years of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, there have been a lot of spells added in various books and various supplementary material. This mod adds many of them, including spells like Green Flame Blade and Booming Blade that enable melee warlocks, and so are sort of core staples of those characters. This mod will let you summon a dragon to fight for you. It will let you do all kinds of truly awesome things that are available in the tabletop version of Dungeons & Dragons, but weren't implemented for whatever reason in Baldur's Gate 3. There's a couple different mods that add tabletop spells to the game. This one, I think, is my favorite, because the design goal for the mod author, when making this mod, was to implement these spells as though they had been added by the Larian devs themselves. So they have a lot of the changes that were made from tabletop to Baldur's Gate worked into the basic design of the spells. Some of the other mods will use just the exact numbers and rules from tabletop D&D, but that's a different system, and Baldur's Gate 3 has some changes. Notably, most spells in Baldur's Gate have much shorter range and much smaller AoE than their tabletop counterparts, because the game just takes place in smaller arenas than the imagination. And so Mystra's spells, unlike a lot of the other additional spell mods, implements those range changes and those effect changes adds things like ice surfaces to spells that it would make sense to have ice surfaces, because that's not really a thing in tabletop D&D. So I think they've done a great job, not only of including all of these spells that I wish had been in the game from the beginning, because I'm a maximalist and just love having tons and tons of tactical options, but they've done so in a way that feels to me very faithful with the design direction and decisions that Larian have made, rather than simply just slapping the numbers in from tabletop. What that means is that these spells are not all, but mostly quite well balanced with Baldur's Gate 3, because they follow the same rules of spell implementation that the spells that are already in the game do, and so they will fit very well with the existing parties and existing strategies that you're using. Enemies can use these spells as well on PC, but not, I believe, on console, because I think it needs a combat extender in order to work on console to have enemies use these spells, but players can use the spells on console. And if you're on PC, then you can have enemies cast them against you as well, which is, of course, pretty awesome because it gives enemies a ton more tactical options. Either way, this will add a lot of variety and replayability to the game, because you will have a whole world of possibilities that you didn't previously have, and that's just very exciting to me at any point. So highly recommend Mystra's spells if you are just looking to increase the level of fun in the game by giving yourself a ton more options. Next up, a mostly cosmetic mod, Wings Unlocked. This one kind of speaks for itself. It lets you take the wings that are available to certain NPCs or from certain summons and use them on your characters. This one is obviously not intended to be like a serious mod with deep tactical balance and possibilities. It gives your characters wings and lets them fly, and that's just awesome. If you ever wanted your characters to just swoop around the battlefield looking dope as heck, then you can do that with Wings Unlocked, and I just think that that's cool. Sometimes a mod doesn't need to be something complicated or a ton of weird tactical possibilities or whatever. Sometimes it can just be wings are sick and your characters can now have wings, and that's great. Wings Unlocked gets my vote for that reason. Next up, another mod that adds a ton of character building options, Tasha's Feats. This mod adds feats from the tabletop sourcebook, Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. So these are feats directly from the tabletop version of the game. For that reason, they're mostly pretty well balanced. One reason I think this is so exciting is that the feats in Baldur's Gate 3 honestly are quite boring. There are not that many of them, and you pretty much take the same ones on every character. You're going to use an ability score improvement or two for every character. You're taking alert on everybody. So getting more feats that lets you kind of specialize and diversify your characters makes the game vastly more interesting. To talk about why that is, we actually have to go back to the very beginning of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, when they first released the very early beta playtests. In fact, even in the closed alpha playtests, which were only available to friends and family, I actually got to see an early copy of these because I knew I had a contact at Wizards of the Coast at the time. And these early playtests of 5e did not have feats at all. Only ability score improvements existed in the game. When they released the game, feats had been a staple of Dungeons & Dragons character building for decades and decades. For every previous system of D&D, feats had been a mainstay. But in 5th edition, they wanted to move away from that and sort of move to a more balanced and simpler system, and they got rid of feats. Players hated this. For good reason, because feats are cool and fun and let you make your character your own. And so they sort of added them very late in development when they were writing Dungeons & Dragons. And you can tell. The feats that exist in the player's handbook in the base Dungeons & Dragons system are not very creative, poorly balanced, and very much clearly an afterthought. And it makes sense because they literally were an afterthought in the development of D&D. And those are the feats that have made it into Baldur's Gate 3. So if you've ever wondered why the Baldur's Gate 3 feats are so boring and so poorly balanced, That's why, because the source material that they're working with is boring and poorly balanced, and Larian also did not put a ton of effort into balancing them for Baldur's Gate 3, so you have things like Alert being ported to Baldur's Gate 3 with the numbers unchanged, even though the initiative system is completely different, making it a totally broken feat. The cool thing about adding the feats from later on in Dungeons & Dragons is that they've learned their lesson since then. So they have developed a lot more feats that are much more interesting mechanically, much cooler, and give your characters a lot more tactical options rather than just like flat numerical bonuses to certain things or very boring effects that either are very weak and so you'll never take them, or wildly overpowered so you have to take them all the time. The Tasha's Cauldron of Everything feats, I think, are much more creative and well-designed than the feats that are in the basic Dungeons & Dragons system. So getting them added to Baldur's Gate 3 gives you a lot of cool options. Not all of them are in, as you can see here, it says this is a work in progress, but even the feats that have been added to the game give your characters a lot of cool and interesting options. So I highly recommend checking this out and following development on this Tasha's Feats mod as more and more of them get added, because it will let your characters explore a mechanic that's in the game in not a very well-developed way, in a way that is much more cool and interesting, and so that will just make character building way more fun in future. So any mod makers that want to add more tabletop feats and cooler feats, I'm all in for you guys. Very happy that this made it into the game. Next up, the Oath of Conquest, Paladin. This is a subclass mod, so it just adds one subclass to the game, to the Paladin class, and it adds the Oath of Conquest. This is a tabletop class, so it's a 5th edition subclass. It's from the sourcebook Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and it is my personal favorite Paladin in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. The Oath of Conquest is based around fear, so it will render enemies afraid very easily, and again, in Baldur's Gate, just like with the Blood Mage and the Witch, fear is a mechanic that sort of exists in Baldur's Gate, but doesn't have a lot of support. You can do cool stuff with the Great Old One Warlock and a bunch of fear-based items, but there aren't characters really that are based around fear as a mechanic, and so adding more depth and interest to those mechanics is very cool. I like this implementation of the Oath of Conquest Paladin as well, because while it is not exactly as it is in tabletop, I think they've done a really good job of translating it to Baldur's Gate 3 and making the Oath of Conquest Paladin work with the mechanics of the video game. So they've really captured the spirit of the class, or the subclass, and made it really interesting. The Oath of Conquest Paladin gives you a lot of options, mostly based around frightening enemies, but also you have sort of advantage on attacks against single enemies, similar to a Vengeance Paladin, and a couple other really cool features. And I think that overall this is just a very well-balanced and well-implemented subclass, because it's a tabletop subclass. It exactly as supported in Dungeons & Dragons as the 3 that made it into Baldur's Gate 3, and so just giving us more options for cool characters to play, I'm always in favor of that. Next up, this is actually 3 mods. I want to highlight a trio of quality of life mods: Infinite Arrows, Infinite Potions, and Infinite Elixirs. Obviously, these are cheat mods. They make these items infinite, so you never run out of them when you have them. You pick up 1 arrow, and you can use that arrow as much as you want, for example. Whether you use this to just cheat and spam out smoke powder arrows every single turn, or whether you just use it to not have to go find those items at merchants when you want them as kind of a quality of life tool, is totally up to you. More power to you, whichever way you choose. But the cool thing about this mod is basically that it saves you time, it saves you clicks, and it saves you effort. Whether you find the game of stockpiling and using and carefully hoarding consumables interesting is going to differ from player to player. Some players really like that kind of resource management mechanic, some players really do not, and these mods let you totally bypass it if you fall in the latter camp. I will caution you that if you use these mods, then there are some combinations of potions that will, and arrows especially, that will mostly break the game. If you have like smoke powder arrows to be used infinitely, it will make the game an awful lot easier. So I would recommend that you exercise some restraint if you're going to use these mods in order to keep the game fun, but also it can just save you an awful lot of time. And if you just want to have a character that casts fire arrows every turn for some kind of theme build, then this definitely lets you do that as well, which I think is pretty cool. This type of thing I think is a great utility to exist in the game. It saves you so many clicks if you are just trying to do like a cool frost and fire arrows archer or something like that. And also if you just want infinite potions because you just like to spam potions every turn, then, great. More potions is always nice. Just wanted to highlight these mods because I think that they are very useful to a wide variety of players, whether you're looking to do a cool themed build or just looking to win the game more easily, then this can give you a great option. Another mod that I think makes the game play out in a much smoother way that both makes a lot more sense and allows for a much wider variety of viable character builds and much more interesting and dynamic combat, in my opinion, is the D20 Initiative mod. This is an implementation of a tabletop rule that was changed for Baldur's Gate 3 for reasons that I'm still pretty unclear on. In Dungeons & Dragons, when characters roll initiative at the start of combat, they roll a d20, a 20-sided die, and add their initiative bonus, which is usually their dexterity modifier, plus any other relevant bonuses. In Baldur's Gate 3, they roll a d4. So the possible variance, the difference between the minimum possible initiative roll and the maximum possible initiative roll, in Tabletop is 19, and in Baldur's Gate 3 is 3. So it is less than a sixth of the possible variance that exists in the tabletop setting. The weird thing about this is that they haven't changed any of the other numbers to account for the gigantic change in the fundamental systems that this entails. So a character who has the alert feat, for example, in Dungeons & Dragons, that gives you a +5 bonus to your initiative for a little under 25% of the possible variance being accounted for by that bonus. In Baldur's Gate 3, you still get that +5 to initiative for 166% of the possible variance accounted for by that bonus. In Baldur's Gate 3, a character with alert can never lose initiative to a character without an initiative bonus. That's not true in base D&D. What this means in Baldur's Gate 3 is that initiative is the god stat. It is by far the best stat in Baldur's Gate 3. Even small bonuses to initiative are absolutely critical. A character with +10 initiative will be guaranteed to go first in every single combat in Baldur's Gate 3 with like 3 exceptions. And if you get +12, you're guaranteed to go first in every combat, which is a truly incredible advantage. A phrase that gets thrown around a lot about Dungeons & Dragons is rocket tag, meaning that characters are so dangerous that whichever team gets to go first will often end combat right off the beginning, especially the player characters who are optimized to end combats immediately, so the enemies will never get to do their cool things that you were sort of hoping that they would get to do if your initiative is high enough. Playing with a d20 initiative means that not only can you afford to sacrifice dexterity on some characters, so you can play your Paladin with 10 dexterity and heavy armor and not have it just be significantly worse because of that. It also means that you're much more likely to see the enemies actually do the things that they are intended to do. And you get to see some of the cool honor mode abilities that would otherwise be, the enemies would simply be stunned or dead before their turns would come around, because some percentage of the time with a d20 initiative roll, you're going to lose initiative. I will say that one thing this does mean is that you are more likely to get split up turns, so you're less likely to be able to use the shared initiative system in Baldur's Gate in order to have your characters like mix and match their actions, where one moves, the other attacks, then the other attacks, then the other moves, and so on. So it does decrease some of that tactical possibility and combos with things like the elemental explosions and whatever that Baldur's Gate adds. But overall, I think that this makes combat more interesting and tactical using the D20 initiative mod. My challenge for modders, actually, is I'd really like to see a D10 initiative mod, because I think that would strike a nice balance between getting to use the shared initiative system and not making Alert just an unbeatably strong feat in Baldur's Gate 3. There isn't currently a D10 initiative mod, as far as I know, so if you're a modder, that should not be that difficult to whip up, and I recommend doing that, because I'd really like to see how that one plays. But the D20 initiative mod, I mean, this is just how Dungeons & Dragons is supposed to be balanced. It's what all of these feats were balanced around. And don't worry, Alert is still a very good feat in tabletop D&D. It's still super powerful. It's just not mandatory on every honor mode character. And so not only does this bring the game more in line with the intended balance of the system, it also lets you build characters in more interesting ways, because you're no longer just forced to get 16 dexterity on every character if you want them to contribute to honor mode. So highly recommend this mod. It is a big change to how the game plays out and requires changing a lot of your assumptions that you have built up over a year of playing Baldur's Gate 3, but I think it's worth it because it makes the game more tactical and interesting. Another subclass mod, although this one is a series of enhancements rather than adding an entirely new subclass, is the Eldritch Knight Plus mod. I really like this mod because I have some gripes with how Eldritch Knight works in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and in Baldur's Gate 3 in particular. I went over these in a little more detail in my fun tier list. If you haven't watched that video, I talked about which characters I found the most fun. But basically the way Eldritch Knight is implemented, it's not very good at doing the thing that I think the character is intended to do. So it makes, as the mod author says, player expression and the subclass fantasy are fairly weak for Eldritch Knight. You want to be a cool battle mage, swinging your sword and casting spells with equal facility, and that's simply not what Eldritch Knight does, because your spellcasting in the basic game is so weak. Eldritch Knight Plus is buffs to the class, and it is, admittedly, buffs to an extremely strong subclass, but they're buffs to a part of the subclass that's relatively weak and doesn't get used, because in Baldur's Gate 3, Eldritch Knight is mostly either just a melee class with shield, a throwing character, or a character that's abusing the items that debuff enemies when you apply a condition to them alongside the War Magic passive, in order to use some of the strong features, not a character that makes weapon attacks and actually casts cool damaging spells. Eldritch Knight Plus sort of solves that problem with two bonuses. One is that you can make ranged spell attacks as a melee attack, as melee spells. So you can use your ranged spells like Eldritch Blast if you happen to have that in melee, which just makes the character play out more smoothly. And the second is that you add additional damage to your cantrips based on your strength or dexterity, so you can still do damage with your spells, even if you're spec'd into one attribute. That just makes the character play much more like a battle mage, and it also adds some more spells known, and some higher level spells, lets you pick from a wider array of spells as well, so you can do a little bit more. And all of that, I think, together just makes the character play out much more like the Eldritch Knight, and much less like the I'm a fighter but I happen to have shield that it plays out like in Baldur's Gate 3 a lot of the time. So I really like this mod because it, as the mod author says, enhances player expression, which is something that I'm always very much in favor of, especially with such a cool concept that really was let down by its execution, as Eldritch Knight is. And finally, the last of the 10 mods that I wanted to highlight is another kind of cheating mod. This does make the game easier, especially if you abuse it, but I wanted to highlight Feats on even levels, because this is a house rule that I use in my own Dungeons & Dragons play. If you were sitting down to a game of 5th edition D&D with me as your DM, you would get a feat every second level, because I think that in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, but also in previous D&D editions, this has been a house rule I've used basically through every edition that I've played for 20 years of D&D, feats have just not been numerous enough to allow players the self-expression that you want when you're building a character. It's especially bad in 5th edition, where ability score improvements are also feats. That didn't used to be true in older editions, and so almost every character is priced into spending 2 feats on ASIs, in order to increase their stat to 20. The game kind of assumes that your main stat is 20, and if you don't spend 2 ASIs on getting it there, it's a lot harder for most characters to function. It's especially bad in Baldur's Gate 3, where the level cap is 12, so most characters only get 3 feats total, 2 of which are almost always ASIs, and 1 of which, for Honor Mode, is almost always Alert. So an awful lot of characters in Baldur's Gate 3 never get to make a decision about what feat they're picking at all. With feats on even levels, you can still take those feats that are sort of taxes, but also take the feats that give you a little more self-expression, a little more interesting tactical options, and just are cooler overall than those other feats. Things like Defensive Duelist or Charger that give you cool options for your character, but are mostly fairly weak, are much more palatable to pick up when you get a few more feats. Obviously, you can also use this just to take 6 of the strongest feats in the game and build a totally cracked character that's absolutely broken, but my recommendation is to use this to pick up the cool and interesting options that you've always gone, man, I wish I could take that, but I just have to take Alert on this character because I keep going last in combat. Feats on even levels totally solves that problem, and gives you the ability to give your characters a little more personality, flavor, and more interesting options. So I like this mod quite a bit for players who are just looking to have their characters be a little more differentiated from the meta builds and do cool things, but still function reasonably well. And players who just want to try out the weird and interesting feats that exist in the game, especially with the other mods that I've recommended that add more feats to the game, without having their characters just be terrible. So feats on even levels I think is really cool for that purpose, and that's why it's a house rule that I've used in D&D for decades, and one that I recommend using in Baldur's Gate 3. Alright my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at 10 awesome new mods available on console, Mac, and of course already on PC. Obviously modding is very personal and different people will enjoy different things, but I think that these mods are very much worth checking out, so I wanted to highlight them for you. And I will continue to do so as we get new drops of cool new mods, as long as that's something people are interested in. If you like this kind of video, definitely do let me know, and also if you didn't like this kind of video, definitely let me know that as well. Obviously this is somewhat experimental for me, just doing like a mod highlight video, but I think it's really fun, and hopefully it gives you some ideas for cool new playthroughs that you can do with Baldur's Gate 3, and interesting things that are now possibilities that weren't before. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a comment. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, and of course if you hit like, it does so as well. As always, the best way to help out a content creator is to hit buttons on YouTube, because YouTube just cares about interaction in general. So appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 builds, more looks at mods, and other strategy game analysis. I also did want to mention that at time of recording we're at exactly 99 channel members, so the next person to sign up as a channel member will be channel member number 100, so that would be kind of cool. It could be you. And of course, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.